Peace be upon you, friends. With you is your friend Darum. I ask you to support the channel by subscribing, liking, and posting motivating comments and an enjoyable viewing experience for you. The attacks were repeated throughout the night, especially when I was trying to sleep, and a few minutes before dawn, the final attack occurred, but this time during the suffocation process and seconds before he left my neck. I heard a voice whispering in my ear and saying, "Do not go to the mosques, for you are not a worshipper." And that ended the last attack, and I fell asleep directly from extreme exhaustion and fatigue. I woke up shortly before sunset, with traces of the attacks on my neck and shoulders from the previous night. I sat on the edge of the bed, sad about my situation, thinking in silence. After a while of thinking, I went to the bathroom, showered, then left the house and went to sit in front of the sea and think until it was almost 11 o'clock at night. I didn't want to go home because what happened to me yesterday was not a simple thing, and its psychological and physical effects are still fresh in my memory and imprinted on my body. So I decided in a moment of despair to go to the house of my old relative who died. I arrived at his house around midnight and hesitated to knock on the door at that late hour, but my fear of returning to my room forced me to knock on the door until his son opened it for me. When I met him, I made up a story to enter his father's room and told him that his father had borrowed some books from me and I wanted them back, so he reluctantly allowed me to enter. I went to my old relative's room and started searching like crazy. I looked everywhere and in every corner, and I did not know what I was looking for. But there was nothing else I could do, so I continued searching until my eyes fell on a box under a pile of clothes. I pulled it to the middle of the room and saw that it was not locked, so I opened it. In it, I found a group of books and some strange papers and drawings. The books inside the box were all in the same shape as the books that my old relative had given me. I wanted to take from her, but I did not know which of them would benefit me and which would harm me, so I decided to leave without taking anything from her. Before I left the old man's son's house, his son said to me, "Why don't you get another one from the same place my dad bought it from?" I told him, "I wish I knew that place." He responded with surprise and said, "I thought you knew the source of these books." I said to him nervously, "Tell me quickly, please, where did your father get these books?" He took a piece of paper and wrote the name of a Gulf country on it, then tore the paper. I said to him, "Why did you do that?" He said, "I am not a fool to enter your world." I said to him, "What scientist?" So he left me and left, and before his departure, he said, "Make sure to close the door when you leave." I left his house and headed straight to the airport and booked the first plane heading to that country that the old man's son had written on that paper before tearing it up in front of me. I returned home and informed my family that I would be traveling for a short period, and despite my mother's attempts to prevent me from traveling, I did not respond to her or her pleas, but in the end, she was able to force me to promise her that I would not be late and would return quickly. I went to my room, took the first book and some simple clothes with me, and went out immediately towards the airport. My father did not know I was leaving because he was asleep, and neither was my brother. Had my mother not been awake by chance, I would not have told her. I did not intend to tell anyone about my departure because I was determined to go and return quickly, within a period not exceeding 3 days. I arrived at the capital airport after less than 2 hours in the air. I landed at the airport and completed all security procedures. Minutes after I left the airport door, I realized that I did not have an address, evidence, or anything that would lead me to the source of the book. I only had the first book, so I headed to the nearest hotel and stayed there until the morning. I didn't sleep much and was out walking around that city with the book with me and no idea what to do next. After a while of wandering around, an idea came to my mind, which was to go to any bookstore. Perhaps it knew the publishing house that published the book or had an idea about the author who wrote it. In fact, I searched for the largest library there and went to it and presented the book to one of the officials in the library, who in turn looked at the book and browsed it for a little, then looked at me and said, "Where did you get this book?" I told him most of my story. The library official was silent for a while, and his facial features changed. Then he broke his silence and said, "You will not find an author or publisher for this book, but I can direct you to someone who might help you in your endeavor." He gave me a description of a library far from the capital in another city where I could find what I was looking for, so I rented a car to go there, but I was asking all the way due to my ignorance of the region. The sun set on the horizon, and the color of the sky changed to red, and the night began to spread its cloak. I wasted a lot of time due to my constant asking questions along the way, and I had not yet arrived. But in the end, after much trouble, I ended up in that small city, and there I found someone who directed me to that library, and after I entered to her, I found books on her shelves, similar to the books I found in my old relative's trunk. But the owner of the bookstore was an old man with a short temper and refused to talk to me about the book. He contented himself with directing me to the house of a person who he said might help me in this regard. Despite my fatigue and exhaustion, I decided to continue the journey and not stop, so I asked a passerby about the way, so he guided me and said, which was. With me, the road you must take is mountainous, rugged, and dangerous at this time of night. He also warned me of something I did not understand. He said, "During the road, you will find people who are tall or short in stature, and they will wave to you to stop. Beware of standing for them. Beware." I continued on my way towards the place the bookstore owner had described to me, and I did not see anyone on my way that night. I arrived at the desired place at dawn and found nothing but a simple house on the side of a mountain covered with greenery. The house had no neighbors and was closer to a hut than to the house. I waited in the car until the sun rose. Then I got out and knocked on the door, and a person about 60 years old with a red beard mixed with some gray and dressed in black opened it for me. He had a colorful turban on his head and looked at me with a frown. Then he looked as if he was watching something behind me and said, "Only you go in, but he should stay outside." The man entered his house and left the door open. I looked behind me and saw no one, so I entered his house, confused because his house was strange. Most of the furniture in the house was made of wood. The ceiling was a bit high, and the place smelled strange. It was like rotting apples, beautiful and disgusting at the same time. I sat in front of him, and before I could speak, he spoke before me and said, "You won't get rid of him easily. Why did you summon him?" I was silent as I looked at him and did not know what to say. He asked me angrily, "Where is his manuscript?" So I gave him the first book, and he threw it in my face angrily and said, "What is this? Where is his manuscript?" I got angry and said to him, "I do not want anything from you." I went to the door, grabbed the handle tightly, opened it, and put my feet on the doorstep to exit. The man said while laughing quietly, "Oh God, you don't know anything about our world, do you?" I shouted at him and said, "I don't want to know." He said to me calmly while browsing the first book, "Keep your foot off the doorstep, boy. If you walk out the door now without knowing his name, your head will be separated from your body in an instant." I said to him, "Who do you mean?" He said that the devil you summoned is waiting for you outside, and now that you prevented him from entering with you, he knows that you are looking for a way to get rid of him, and he will not leave his place until he kills you. I said to him, "Why would he kill me?" He said, "Because you came to the place that can make you control it and get rid of it." I said, "Then tell me the way I can get rid of it." He said, I cannot do without the manuscript that I used to summon him, and no matter how hard you try, you will not be able to leave here without knowing the deterrent method for that devil, because he will remain outside waiting for you without falling asleep or getting tired, summer and winter, even if it takes him 100 years to wait for you. He will not leave his place until he kills you. I swallowed my saliva as I looked out through the open door and began to step back, moving away from the door that I was only one step away from. I said to the man as I stared out in a faint voice filled with fear, "What are we going to do now?" He said to me, "Come here, boy, and sit next to me." I sat with the man for several hours, telling him my story and how I ended up at his doorstep. He was silent for a while and then said, "You only have one solution." I said to him, "What is it?" So he got up from his place and motioned with his hand towards me to follow him. So I went behind him to a large room full of huge books and volumes. It was like a public library, and its shelves were high, some of which required a short ladder to reach them. He said to me while I was staring at that huge library with an open mouth and wide eyes, "Do you like reading?" So I said to him, with my mouth still open and my eyes staring at those high shelves, "I love her, but not to the degree that you love her." The man laughed and said, "Search for it among these books and you will find it and its name, and then you will know how to get rid of it." I closed my mouth and looked at him and said, "But where do I start?" he said as he pulled out a chair and placed it behind me. "It doesn't matter which book you start from. It won't make a difference because we know nothing about it. You are, as they say, looking for a needle in a haystack." I sat on the chair staring at that huge library, and while I was staring at it, the man put his hands on my shoulders and said, "Don't waste time. It may take a long time." I smiled and said to him, "I promised my mother that I would not be late, and I do not intend to." So he lifted his hands from my shoulders as they left the library and said, "Then get started." I started reading and thought it would take hours or at most a few days, but it took 3 whole years, only a few weeks missing. And every time I tried to go out and I was in a state of despair in order to reassure my family and my mother in particular, the man would warn me against going out, and that thing standing outside might do to me if I stepped one step out the door. I lived among those damned books that talked about everything related to the other world. I became familiar with many of their sciences, but I knew nothing about my devil who stands at the door.
A friendship relationship developed between me and the man over those years. He began to feel sorry for my condition, and he always said a word that I will never forget as long as I live. He used to say, "Be patient with your sin." I didn't know its meaning, but I loved hearing it from him and felt comfortable when he said it. During those 3 years, I read more than 2/3 of the library, which was a collection of books, blogs, and individual papers, in addition to some strange symbols that carried unknown meanings.
I did not understand their meaning except with an explanation from that man. On an unforgettable day when rain was falling heavily on the slopes of the Green Mountain, I read this line: "Jinn rose from the dust, and his master was crying in Aden." I remembered the word jinn that was written in the Black Book in a different handwriting, and I began to cry unconsciously. I carried the book to the man to place it in his hands, pointing to that accursed name with my finger, while I was crying like a child, as if I were imprisoned, receiving confirmation of his innocence. The man looked at me with the book open in front of him and said, "Is this your devil, boy?" I nodded with my head, yes, because my voice was lost from the intensity of crying. The man sat me next to him and told me the story of the rebellious companion, Dajan, in detail. After the man finished telling the story of jinn, he told me that the book I had read was not about the Quran, but rather it was a trick to conjure jinn. This is a trick that some magicians and sorcerers use to release their demons and enable them to reach the general public to harm them.